Good evening, everyone, and a happy early St. Patrick's Day. My name is Emily Hill-Wright, and I am the Director of Operations at the Merchants House Museum. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to In the Footsteps of Bridget Murphy, a virtual house tour. During this evening's tour, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen. I'll be happy to answer any questions if we have time at the end of the tour. Before we meet Bridget Murphy, let's set the stage. The Merchants House, located on East 4th Street in Lower Manhattan, was built in 1832. But our story really begins a decade earlier with the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. The Erie Canal was really transformative and helped to turn New York from a small port city into a thriving metropolis. Goods could now come in through New York, they could be sent up the Hudson River and out the Erie Canal to the rest of North America. Lots of goods were coming into New York, lots of people were coming into New York, and lots of money was coming into New York. And so this brand new merchant class, men who imported and exported goods, made a tremendous amount of money in the 1820s and 1830s. At the time, all of New York City was located downtown by the seaport, which had become increasingly congested, noisy, and dirty. This new wealthy merchant class began looking for a quieter, cleaner, and less crowded place to live. And on an island, they went the only direction they could, uptown. These wealthy individuals chose what was then known as the Bond Street area. You can see the map to the left of your screen. That red dot is the Merchants House. And the Bond Street area went from Art Street, now Astor Place at the northern boundary, down to Bleecker Street, and from Broadway to the west to Bowery to the east. Lafayette Place, which you see outlined there in the center of your screen, was created in 1825. And so this is a new neighborhood when the Merchants House was built in 1832. The demand to live in this neighborhood happened quickly. The neighborhood was developed quickly, and so the houses were all built quickly. And as a result, the houses were very similar to one another. The illustration to the right of your screen is of Bond Street, just south of 4th Street. And you can see the houses lining Bond Street here are all architecturally very, very similar to one another. And as we'll see, very similar to the Merchants House. At the bottom of your screen, there's a newspaper ad for the Merchants House. And it describes the house as being replete with every convenience. And so we'll talk a little bit about what some of those conveniences were as we make our way through the house today. And so here we are at the Merchants House on 4th Street. This is a desirable neighborhood. As we said, the houses are all very similar, both architecturally in terms of their floor plan and also in terms of the decorations and interior design. Today, we might make personal choices in home decor to express our individuality or our sense of style. But in the 19th century, these wealthy families wanted their homes to look just like their neighbors, to show that they really belonged in this elite class. This is really useful to us today because people who lived in these homes used their homes in similar ways. And so through diaries and letters of the period, as well as, of course, the house itself, we can get a really great picture of how families in this neighborhood and their Irish servants actually lived. And so this is something that I really encourage you to think about during today's tour. The physical structure of a house has an enormous impact on the way that people, including servants, live and work in that space. The Merchants House, as we said, was built in 1832, and in 1835, it was sold to hardware merchant Seabury Treadwell. Seabury Treadwell was born out on Long Island and came to New York as a young man to make his fortune. He and his wife, Eliza, paid $18,000 for this house in 1835, and they moved in with their then 7 children. Elizabeth, the oldest, was a teenager, about 14, and Sarah, the youngest at the time, was an infant, under a year old. 5 years later, in 1840, the Treadwells' 8th and final child was born, a daughter named Gertrude. Gertrude was born here at the Merchants House. She lived here her entire life. She never married, and she died in the house in 1933, nearly 100 years after her father had purchased the home. The Merchants House opened as a museum 3 years later, and today is complete with the Treadwell family's original furnishings and personal possessions. But today we are going to talk about the other members of the household who lived here alongside the Treadwells in the 19th century, the servants. In the mid-19th century, the Treadwells had 4 live-in servants. We know this from census records. And so if we look here at the 1855 New York State Census, we've got Seabury Treadwell here at the top of your screen, but down at the bottom, surrounded by that red box there, are the servants. You can see, looking at this census, that we have 4 women living and working here in the home. They are all immigrants, and 3 of them are from Ireland. It was so common to have Irish servants working in your home that Bridget, typical Irish name, actually became a slang term. And so instead of talking about the servants that you employed or the maids in your home, you might talk about the Bridgets that you employed, or you might call all of your servants Bridget. So even if her name were actually Mary or Catherine, you might just call her Bridget anyway. If we look at this 1855 census, you can see the names of the servants. We have Mary Smith, Mary James, Anne Clark, and Bridget Murphy, who is 19 years old. So our Bridget is 19. She has been in New York only for 2 years at this time. And so today we are going to be going through the house the way that Bridget might have seen it when she was just starting out as a brand new servant, freshly arrived from Ireland to America. So who was Bridget? Other than the information on the census, we don't know anything for certain about who she was. We don't know where in Ireland she came from, and we don't know what happened to her after 1855. So on our tour today, Bridget really becomes a stand-in for a typical servant. She becomes an everywoman. The photos on your screen were taken at the Merchant's House a few years ago by photographer Hal Hirschhorn, who uses a camera fitted with a 19th century lens. He develops his images using a salt print process, which was first invented in the 1830s. And so although we have no images of the servants who lived and worked at the Merchant's House, we hope that these evocative images pay tribute to Bridget and to her colleagues. Like many young women in service, Bridget is an immigrant to America from Ireland. The life in Ireland that she left behind is likely from a small rural farming community. She has traveled to America alone in search of work in service in houses like this one to support her family while they struggled during the Irish potato famine. The Irish potato famine, as you probably know, was a blight on the potato crop in Ireland in the 1840s that caused massive hunger and starvation, causing people to emigrate. In the 1840s, the Irish comprised half of all immigrants to the United States. Bridget might speak some English and have a basic education, but she is generally untrained in the skills necessary for life in America and the skills for this job. For example, Bridget most likely had a dirt floor in Ireland, not carpeting like we see at the Merchant's House. So how did Bridget get here? After her family and her community scraped together the $20 that it cost to send her to America, and she survived a multi-month-long boat journey alone to a strange country, she arrived here in Lower Manhattan in search of work. Jobs in domestic service are bountiful for young Irish women, and that is why she has come here. Remember, the Erie Canal brought in all this new money to New York, and so families who couldn't afford servants a few generations ago now all of a sudden had enough disposable income. Houses like this one are new for the city of New York, and this merchant class, like the Treadwells that live in these houses, desperately need servants to help everything run smoothly. So how did she get this job? Jobs are so plentiful that Bridget can find a job right away. She has a few options in the 1850s of how to get a job. There are for-profit intelligence offices that take a fee from servants and employers for placing them together. These for-profit offices were sometimes nefarious and often took advantage of both employee and employer. There were some nonprofit employment agencies run by the city or the Catholic Church to help place young women in new jobs. But most often it is family, friends, or word of mouth of both servants and employers alike that help a girl like Bridget find a job. The demand for servants is so high at this time that 60% of employed Irish women in New York City are working in service. And according to the 1855 census, servants are actually the largest occupational class in the entire city. So New York is just filled to the brim with young Irish women who are working in service. We know their story from the census, from banking data, from diaries and letters. We know that the hours were very long and the work was hard. But from their letters, mostly we know that they were desperately lonely while trying to make a life in this strange place. The story of these young women is often forgotten when we talk about the history of New York City, but they actually changed the face of the city forever. So once Bridget has found her job here at the Treadwell home and she arrives to start her work, what happens next? For that, we will step into the ground floor of the museum, into the front room, which is the family room. The family room here is a private family-only space for the Treadwells. They never would have invited guests down to this level, and so this room is a little bit more modest than the parlors that we'll see upstairs used for entertaining. The sofa, for instance, in this room is one that the Treadwells brought with them when they moved to this house. This sofa dates to the 1820s, and by the time Bridget is working here in 1855, this is an old-fashioned, out-of-style piece of furniture. The Treadwells can spend their money on new, stylish furniture for the rooms that they use for entertaining, and keep this sofa down here in this room where it just sort of serves a practical purpose. However, this is a room where Mrs. Treadwell will meet with tradespeople and where she will interview servants like Bridget. And so there are details like this ornate marble fireplace that leave no doubt that this is indeed a wealthy home. So most likely the family room here is where Mrs. Treadwell would have interviewed Bridget, or later in the 19th century, one of the Treadwell daughters. We know that Phoebe Treadwell, pictured at the right of your screen, took over some of the servant hiring responsibilities once she became an adult. So Mrs. Treadwell would explain the requirements of the job. Bridget would negotiate her wages, her time off, and her housing. Bridget is a newly arrived immigrant. She's untrained, and so she would most likely be making the average servant's wages, which are $3 to $4 a month, with room and board here in the Treadwell house included. While that seems very low to us today, that is actually almost double what was available for women in other jobs. And having the room and board in a safe, clean neighborhood was absolutely an additional perk. Highly trained servants or cooks could command much, much more money. The number of people in a house could affect wages as well as the labor required. For example, a newborn baby would create a lot more work, and so Bridget would have been able to negotiate for a higher salary. Attempting to get higher wages elsewhere was one of the main reasons why servants left jobs. So once Bridget developed the skills required of her, she can ask for more money and quit this job and find another one. Even with as many young Irish women as were pouring into New York in the mid-19th century, the demand still outpaced the supply. So Bridget really does have some leverage here. Time off, Bridget would have most likely had Thursday nights free. That was common to give off for your servants, and she would have had some time off on Sunday to attend church. Church attendance was likely a source of tension between Bridget and Mrs. Treadwell. The Treadwells, like many of their peers, were Protestants. They were Episcopalian, and Bridget, like many young Irish servant women, is Catholic, and probably very active in her church community here in America. This divide between Protestants and Catholics might not seem so large to us today, but in the 1850s, this was a huge cultural difference that caused a lot of friction in the household. The Irish experienced a lot of prejudice in America at this time, as they were seen as the new cultural outsiders. In this newspaper ad from 1855, you can see only one of these ads seeking servants contains the now famous line, "No Irish need apply." But if you look closely, you'll see that every other ad in this section requests only Protestant workers, effectively barring Irish immigrants from the job. I do want to point out, if you look at the cook wanted ad here, you can see that the wages for this cook are $8 a month. So if you compare that to Bridget's expected salary of $3 to $4 a month, you can see what a large range there would be for servants. Finally, after ironing out all of the details of her new job, Bridget would hear about her expected tasks for the week. Mrs. Treadwell would have a set timeline of tasks required of Bridget on different days of the week. This would not change too much unless there were a dinner party or some other special occasion. A set timeline was extremely important to ensure that the family is not constantly running into the servants all throughout the house. This is a real choreographed routine. As we'll see, making our way through the house today, there is no back staircase at this house. And so at the beginning of the tour, I encourage you to think about the way that the architecture of the house impacts how people are living here. And so this is a clear example of that. This choreography becomes very, very important. Stepping into the kitchen here, Bridget would start her day off before dawn downstairs here in this room. The servants were expected to get up well before the rest of the family was awake. One advice manual explains that an hour that you're at work before the family is awake is worth more than 2 once they're awake. So she would have gotten an early start. There are, as we saw from census, 4 servants in this house. There likely would have been a cook. The cook would have had a helper. There would have been a parlor maid primarily responsible for the parlor floor, and also a chambermaid primarily responsible for the bedroom floor. However, it's important to remember that other than the cook, it's likely that Bridget and the 2 others were largely maids of all work, and they would have had duties in all aspects of housework. They would not have had very specific jobs like you might see in huge houses later in the century, the mansions at Newport, or grand estates in Europe. Bridget, however, has just been hired, which makes her the most junior servant. And so she is, unfortunately, responsible for some of the worst tasks. One of the most difficult tasks in this house, the most physical tasks, is keeping the house warm. Any radiators that you see in any of the photographs on our tour today were installed when the house was converted into a museum in the 1930s. The entire time that the Treadwells lived here, they relied on coal to heat this house. Coal was delivered through a chute in the sidewalk down to the cellar. So you see inside that chute to the right of your screen. And so Bridget would have gotten her bucket. She would have gone down to the cellar, filled her bucket up with coal, and then started to climb stairs. So she'd climb up a flight of stairs to the ground floor. Here, there would have been a stove in the kitchen, as well as the fireplace in the family room. She'd climb up another flight of stairs to the parlor floor. Same thing, there are 2 fireplaces on that floor. And also there would have been a small stove near the front door to help with drafts. You climb another flight of stairs up to the bedroom floor, 2 fireplaces there. Another flight up with this bucket of coal to the children's bedroom level, same thing, 2 fireplaces there. And then finally, that last flight of stairs up to the servants' quarters. Bridget would climb something like 90 stairs, carrying this heavy bucket of coal before she could heat her own bedroom. When this house was built in 1832, coal stoves existed, but they were new technology. And as today, people were hesitant about adopting this newfangled technology. And so when this house was first built, there was simply an open hearth for cooking. This is something Bridget would have been familiar with from back home in Ireland. However, by mid-century, the Treadwells did install a coal cook stove. With 8 burners and several ovens, the stove enabled the cook to make lots of different dishes at different temperatures, all at the same time with much greater ease. However, there's a steep learning curve to stoves like this. The temperature was controlled by dampers, so how much air you allowed inside would impact the oxygen levels and thus the strength of the fire. But there were no thermostats, and so it was difficult to tell when the right temperature had been reached, and it was really easy for the fire to accidentally go out. So this was likely a huge adjustment for Bridget, who would have been familiar with that open hearth. Learning this new technology that she has likely never seen before would have been a challenge and something that we know many servants wrote home or complained about. However, I do imagine for servants who might have used a stove like this at a previous job, they must have been so relieved when the Treadwells installed a coal cook stove. Once you're comfortable with the technology, it's certainly easier and much safer to cook on a stove like this versus on an open hearth. You know, you can imagine today you upgrade your computer and it takes a while for you to learn how the new thing works, but then once you're used to it, you'd never want to go back to the older technology. In addition to the difficulty of learning how a stove like this works, there's also the cleaning. This stove is made of iron, and so it needs to be thoroughly dried after cleaning. Periodically, Bridget would have been responsible for blacking the stove, rubbing it all over this with a waxy stove polish. This was a necessary task, but extremely arduous. The elaborate dinner parties that we associate with the end of the 19th century, this sort of course after course after course of food, really would have been impossible without technology like this. And so it's an example of the way that new technology is changing the way that people are entertaining their friends. It's changing the kind of food that they're eating. And of course, Bridget had to learn too and was a part of this change. The cook, of course, would have had dominion over this kitchen from morning until night, preparing 3 meals a day for a minimum of 14 people without the modern amenities. Daily tasks for Bridget in this kitchen would have included helping with the cooking, helping with bread baking, and preparing the beehive oven. You see the beehive oven built into the brick to the left of the stove there. And here is a close-up of that oven. A beehive oven like this, it's dome-shaped like a beehive on the inside, and of course, filled with bricks. And it works very much like a brick pizza oven. If you've been to a restaurant with a brick pizza oven, Bridget would build the fire inside this oven, and the bricks, of course, would become extremely hot. And then as the bricks cooled down over the course of the day, the cook could make things that needed progressively lower and lower temperatures. So you'd start your day when the oven is very hot, baking things like bread. And then as the oven cooled down over the day, you could bake things that needed lower temperatures. Bread was an absolute staple of the 19th century diet. Bread was served at every single meal. A bread recipe in an 1841 cookbook calls for 21 quarts of flour to make enough bread for a family of 4 or 5. In 1855, when Bridget worked here at the Treadwells' home, there were 14 people living in this house. And so if we do that math, that's over 60 quarts of flour. The entire bread baking process, from mixing the dough, kneading the dough, shaping the loaves, letting them rise, and baking, took about 4.5 hours. And unfortunately for Bridget and the other servants, this was not a job that you could do without scrutiny. Bread was so important that Mrs. Treadwell certainly would have kept a close eye on the entire process. Ladies' manuals actually instructed wealthy women that they themselves should be prepared to take over the bread baking for the family if the cook was not up to the task, as a woman who served bad bread was considered a bad hostess. Water is a really interesting question in the 19th century. We see the sink here in the corner and these utility tubs between the windows in the kitchen. The Croton Reservoir, which provided New York with its first municipal water supply, opened in 1842. So that's a solid 10 years after the Merchant's House was built. Obviously, people still need water, even if there's no city water supply. And so what do? Well, poor families would rely on neighborhood wells. There would be wells throughout the city, and so you'd get your bucket, you'd go out, you'd pump water into your buckets, and you'd carry water home again every single time you needed water. As the city, of course, became more and more populated, the groundwater coming from these wells became more and more contaminated. And well water was often the source of the outbreak of diseases. To the right of your screen, you see this political cartoon here showing the risks of drinking this sort of contaminated water. The Treadwells, being a wealthy family, don't have to rely on neighborhood wells. They actually have out in the backyard here a cistern. The cistern is buried in the backyard and collects a couple thousand gallons of rainwater. And so you see to the left of your screen is the cap of the cistern. To the right of your screen is a photograph from the 1970s when the cistern was excavated. And so you can see sort of toward the bottom of the screen, a great big hole there that allowed curators to take a peek inside. The cistern has since been filled in. But this thousands of gallons of rainwater was then pumped into this kitchen space. And so from the time this house was built in 1832, this house had running water. And interestingly, the pipe segment that you see right here circled in red is original to the house. It's also 1832. And so that indicates that there may have even been a water heater in this kitchen, which would mean both hot and cold running water. So imagine how Bridget felt when she started working in this home, that she's come here from Ireland, where she lived in a small cottage with her entire family, to move into a house where you've got your first job here in New York, and there is hot and cold running water. What an astonishing luxury. I will say too that the tap water would have been used for cleaning, for bathing, for doing any sort of dishes, laundry. For drinking and cooking, the Treadwells actually had bottled water delivered. Clean water would have been packaged in bottles or barrels outside the city and carted in at great expense. One of the biggest problems, of course, with not having a municipal water supply and a city sewer system is that the city was filthy. It was disgusting. And so Bridget and the other servants would have had to deal with mice, rats, cockroaches, and other vermin on a daily basis. On the other side of the kitchen is this pie safe. It's got panels of tin with holes punched in it to allow air to circulate while preventing any easy access. But if you look down at the legs of this pie safe, you can see here that they're slightly discolored. And it's because you would have placed the legs of this piece of furniture in small dishes of water or poison in order to prevent anything from crawling up the outside and getting into your food. And so anytime people say how nice it must have been to have lived in this house, this is what I think about, just how awful that sounds, of having things crawling up your furniture. Above the pie safe, and then also above the sink on the other side of the room, you see the servant call bells. Each bell had a different chime and connected to a different room in the house. And so Bridget would come down to this room first thing in the morning. She'd start getting ready for the day, and sooner or later, one of these bells would start ringing. And based on the sound, she would know which room she was being called to upstairs. Going by the sound is useful for two reasons. One, there's no need to look up. If Bridget is busy chopping vegetables or kneading bread dough, she doesn't have to look up to see which bell is ringing. And also, if the bells are labeled, Bridget needs to know how to read the labels. And so to go by sound means that being literate is not a requirement of this job. So this work is extremely physically demanding. We talked about the coal bucket. Laundry is something else that would have been back-breaking work, carrying heavy loads of laundry down to this kitchen, washing all of the laundry, hanging it all out to dry or laying it out in the backyard to dry. Bridget is coming into contact with fire constantly. Ironing was a task that often caused injury. And this is really scary because while there is a lot of job opportunity here in New York, there is a lack of job security. No one will hire a servant who is injured or sick. If the other servants could cover for you, if you had a temporary illness or a temporary injury, you could rest and recover. But you could be dismissed and turned out of a home if you were sick or injured for too long. To the back of the house is the garden. Today, our garden is a beautiful space and visitors love to spend time out there. But in the 19th century, this was a workspace. This was not a place where the Treadwell family would have gathered to enjoy being outdoors. Bridget would have spent time working on tasks here in the garden. She would have done laundry, might have been done out here, any sort of kitchen chores that could have been done out here, peeling potatoes, shucking oysters. The garden also provides access to street life. Behind the garden would have been an alley. And so workmen would have had access to this yard from that alley. And so this is a place where Gertrude could gather with the other servants to gossip with friends or neighbors who might be sort of visiting you surreptitiously, or to get news from delivery men or other servants who are walking by. Since there is so little time off, these visits are really crucial for Bridget's social life, as well as her relationship with the other servants. The main source, however, of friends and outside connections would have been Bridget's church community. The Catholic Church was the main way that these young servant women stayed in contact to Ireland and other people. They would attend Mass, of course, but they would meet with friends and gossip, get news from home. The church even held dances and social gatherings where young women like Bridget could meet other people, including potentially meeting a husband. But back inside the house, the family finally is awake, and they have come downstairs to the family room to have breakfast. And so this speaks to that choreographed dance that we talked about. While the family is eating breakfast here in the family room, Bridget must use that time to make her way upstairs to prepare the parlors for the day's activities. And so here we are up one flight of stairs and into the front parlor. Hopefully, the first thing that you notice is just how different this parlor room is from the family room that we saw downstairs. Everything on this level is meant to impress. It's meant to speak to the Treadwells' wealth. It's meant to tell visitors that the Treadwells have great taste, that they know the newest styles, that they belong in this elite neighborhood. Because the parlors are the most public space in the house, this is a high priority for the Treadwells and therefore for Bridget to keep these rooms looking their absolute best. So on a regular day, this would have involved dusting, maintaining the upholstery, and cleaning the fireplaces. Lighting was a huge source of work for Bridget. She would have been in charge of maintaining the candles, trimming the wicks and cleaning the wax, and refilling and cleaning the oil lamps, as well as lighting and cleaning the gasoliers. The Treadwells installed gas lighting in this house in the 1850s, and it's truly one of the biggest upgrades that they could have made. Before gas lighting, they relied on candles and on oil lamps, as we see here. Candles flicker, which is lovely. It's very romantic for a dinner party, but it's not super useful if we're trying to read a book or do needlework. Oil lamps, like you see to the right of your screen, had a much brighter, steadier flame than candles, so that's good, but they burned animal fat like whale oil, which was extremely expensive. It produced a lot of smoke, and it also had a very foul smell. And so to be able to make this transition to gas lighting, which was bright and it was reliable and it didn't smoke up your room and it didn't have a horrible odor, would have been really revolutionary. As we said, the Treadwells brought gas to the house in the 1850s. It would have been very disruptive. They would have had to pull up floorboards to lay gas pipe throughout the house. And so you can imagine Bridget's horror when these gas fixtures were turned on for the very first time. There must have been so much dust and dirt from the construction, but also imagine seeing a room fully illuminated for the very first time. Imagine all of the dark corners of this room that you're seeing dirt that you never saw before. It must have been truly, truly horrifying for Bridget and the other servants. Speaking of dirt, some of the more complicated work for Bridget in the parlors would be these beautiful lace curtains. Of course, they're very lovely, but they serve a functional purpose. They are, for all intents and purposes, a 19th century window screen. These lace curtains are keeping the filth of the streets of New York City from getting inside the parlors. As you can imagine, this is a losing battle. Bridget would spend countless hours cleaning the curtains and all the dirt that snuck past them. A deep cleaning would have been done twice a year and would have been one of the busiest times for Bridget. The Treadwells would hire some outside help for heavy tasks like cleaning the chimneys, but Bridget would have been expected to do a lot of the heavy cleaning herself. These beautiful large pier mirrors that you see between the windows, cleaning the paintings and the frames, and the carpeting throughout the house. For a normal day-to-day cleaning, Bridget swept the rugs in this room and the other rooms with a broom. Unlike today, when wall-to-wall carpeting is installed in one very large piece, carpeting in the 19th century was laid down in strips. And so if you look closely at your screen, you can actually see the seam lines of the carpet here toward the top and bottom of your screen. And so the carpet was laid down in strips and then the pattern matched up like wallpaper. So during this deep cleaning, the carpet could actually be pulled up and removed to be deep cleaned outside with a carpet beater. Again, this is a tremendously physically demanding job. Exposure to the grandeur of the Treadwells' home certainly would have had an impact on Bridget. Remember, she is coming from a rural and isolated background in Ireland, and seeing houses like this one and the social dynamics of the Treadwells was aspirational to many young women like Bridget, who wanted to adapt this American lifestyle to their own homes. But the cultural and economic gap was wide and hard to cross. So for example, the Treadwells piano here in this room, which dates to the 1840s, is a real status symbol. A piano like this would have said to anyone who came in the house, that this is a very wealthy family. For Bridget in particular, a piano like this would have been the equivalent of 5 years' rent at a tenement apartment downtown. This is an extremely expensive piece of furniture. However, cultural exchange did work both ways. So while expensive furniture like this piano might have been aspirational to Bridget, Irish culture did seep into the lives of the Treadwells as well. The popularity of Irish music was one way that this would have happened at the time. And so we know that there are ballads of Irish songs that young women like the Treadwell daughters would have played on the piano. So you can imagine how strange that must have been for Bridget to have this extremely expensive piano and the daughters of the house playing familiar Irish folk tunes that Bridget might have grown up knowing. To the right of your screen is a traditional Irish song, Paddy O'Rafferty. This sheet music was first published in New York in 1812. So you can see we are seeing Irish songs and Irish culture in New York as well. So we've seen the front parlor, but now if we turn around, we can look into the rear parlor. The rear parlor served many different functions. It was a slightly less formal sitting room than the front parlor, and so might have been used for more family activities versus the entertaining that took place in the front parlor. The doors between the two parlors were typically kept closed, and when guests came to dinner, the rear parlor was used as a dining room. Dinner service was a major part of life and entertaining for families like the Treadwells, and it absolutely would have been a big part of Bridget's job. Dinners for guests were very complicated, and so the servants in this house would be participating throughout the day to help prepare for the dinner, and then also, of course, to clean up afterwards. Since the parlors are the most public space in this house, the servants become part of the way to showcase your wealth to visitors as the styles of dining changed to include servants more. To talk about the way that food was served, the more traditional way, common in the very early part of the 19th century, was called Old English style, where guests would serve themselves from plates, sort of what we might call family style today. To the left of your screen is an illustration showing the table settings for an Old English style. The thing about Old English style is that wealthy families like the Treadwells are displaying their wealth with the sheer quantity of food on the table. There would be many, many platters of food. You can see here in this illustration that we've got turkey, duck, oysters, and ham, as well as lots of different types of vegetables, all in the same meal. And so you're really showing how wealthy you are by having an overabundance of food on the table. However, in the mid-19th century, dining and food became slightly more complicated, and French food really took over. And so the style changed from Old English to dining à la Russe. In dining à la Russe, instead of impressing your guests with the sheer quantity of food on the table, you would be impressing your guests with the silver, the china, and the crystal on the table. And so instead of, you take all of that food off the table, you've got more space for beautiful plateware and silverware. And then the servants serve the food directly to every single guest. At dinner, as dinner parties like this became important ways that wealthy families entertained, Bridget and the other servants were expected to learn all of these rules. This is a complicated thing to learn, but Bridget would have needed to know how to serve at the table, how to present herself in front of guests, when it was appropriate to speak, if at all. The cook would have been responsible for managing the dinner party, and it's likely that the most senior maid would be present during the party itself. Being a senior maid is something that Bridget probably aspired to, as it certainly paid a lot more money and it came with more freedom and more responsibility. The senior maid would have been in charge of training Bridget in one of her most important jobs, answering the front door. This is a huge responsibility. In order to do this job, Bridget needs to speak good English. She needs to know how to present herself. And most importantly, she needs to know who to let in and how to speak with guests. Social rules were something that probably took a lot of explaining. In answering the doors, one of the newest and most foreign customs for Bridget to learn is this ritual of ceremonial calling. Of course, there were no telephones in the 19th century, and so to keep in touch with friends and neighbors, women would go on what was known as a ceremonial call. You see at the top of your screen Eliza Treadwell's calling card. It's about the size of a business card and just printed with her name, Mrs. Seabury Treadwell. When going on a ceremonial call, women would ring the doorbell and Bridget would answer. The caller then had the option of either just leaving her card, almost like leaving a voicemail today or sending a text. It's sort of a hi, I'm thinking of you. Or she could place an in-person visit. Of course, it's possible that Mrs. Treadwell wasn't ready to receive callers or just wasn't interested in seeing a particular person. And so Bridget is sort of like a nightclub bouncer here. She has to have a clear sense of Mrs. Treadwell's social life, so she knows who to let in and who she should politely turn away. If Mrs. Treadwell was not available for a visit, or if she just didn't want to see a certain person, Bridget would tell that caller that Mrs. Treadwell was not at home. The vestibule here at the front of the house features a faux marble painting technique on the walls, which you see in the bottom right of your screen. The walls in this room were painted with a turkey feather to mimic the look of marble. This is an incredibly expensive and very impressive first look at this house for visitors. So once the guests are set to arrive to visit with Mrs. Treadwell in the parlors, Bridget would head upstairs to the bedrooms to freshen them up while the downstairs rooms are being used. So here we go up the stairs and stepping into into Seabury's bedroom. While the family is receiving callers or Mr. Treadwell is working, Bridget would be up here to clean and tidy the bedrooms. Bridget would have spent time resetting the fires in the fireplaces and also making the bed. While making a bed is similar then as it is today, it required a lot of steps and was very time consuming. Making the bed could actually take 2 servants almost an hour to flip and fluff the mattress and air out all the linens. Again, this is extremely physically demanding work, as was cleaning and setting these fireplaces. To clean the fireplaces, Bridget would have laid a cloth across the floor and across the bed to ensure that soot doesn't travel all over the house. She would then clean out the fireplaces and relay the coals. Seabury Treadwell died here in this room in 1865. Sickness and death would have provided so much extra work for Bridget and the other servants. Bridget might have had to go fetch the doctor or run other errands that were not part of her usual work. There's also additional laundry, of course, special meals that need to be prepared, and the household is just not running like normal. As we've said throughout, having a routine is extremely important in a house like this, and sort of illness would have done a lot to disrupt that normal routine. And that's not to mention just the stress of having sickness in the house. Seabury Treadwell died of kidney failure, but contagious diseases were rampant, and the fear of catching sick herself must have been on Bridget's mind. Seabury Treadwell died in the house in 1865, and his funeral took place downstairs in the front parlor. Today, we might go to a funeral parlor, but in the 19th century, people used their own parlors for funerals. And so again, a funeral would have been an enormous amount of extra work for the servants, making sure that the house is properly cleaned so that when guests come, they're seeing a pristine house. You can imagine too that after weeks of taking care of a sick family member, probably some of your regular day-to-day tasks might have fallen by the wayside. And so cleaning for a big event like a funeral would have been a lot of extra work. Stepping into the other bedroom on this floor, this is Mrs. Treadwell's bedroom. In the 19th century, it was common in wealthy households for husbands and wives to sleep separately. Rooms served different functions than just sleeping. And so you can imagine too what a big cultural difference this would be for Bridget, who most likely grew up in a small house with her entire family living very closely together. And so here in this house, to have the husband and wife have separate bedrooms would have been a real difference for her. Eliza would have used this bedroom as a sitting room to entertain very close female friends. And so Bridget, again, needs to know what the plan is for the day so that she can be sure that this room is clean and ready for whatever Eliza needed. You certainly wouldn't want to be in the middle of cleaning the fireplace, for example, when Eliza showed up with a friend looking for a private place to chat. The small bed in this room would have been used if any of the children became ill. They'd be brought down here and kept in this room with their mother during recovery. Childbirth also took place at home. Gertrude Treadwell, as we said, was born in this house in 1840. There were also several Treadwell grandchildren who were born in this house in the 1850s as well. We know that Bridget is here in 1855. If she had been here the previous October, Treadwell granddaughter Lily Nichols was born right here in this room in October of 1854. Again, like sickness or death, childbirth would have created so much extra work for Bridget and the other servants. On the floor in this room is a hat tub, looks like a straw hat that's been turned upside down. While we did have running water in the kitchen space, indoor plumbing didn't come to the rest of this house until much later in the 19th century. And so if you're going to take a bath, you would do it in a tub like this one. If Mrs. Treadwell wanted to bathe, the hat tub would be brought up to her bedroom, and then Bridget would have to haul up hot water to fill this tub so that Mrs. Treadwell could have her bath. And then, of course, when she was done, the water would need to be poured back into buckets and carried back downstairs again. If Bridget wanted to have a bath, you can bet that this tub would have been brought down to the kitchen where it was really close to the water supply. You want to make your life as easy as possible. Of course, no indoor plumbing means no indoor toilets, means chamber pots for indoor use. The bottom of your screen here, we see a chamber pot from this room. It would have been Bridget's job as the newest and least senior servant to clean out the chamber pots every morning. She would have gone through the bedrooms and dumping the contents of the chamber pots into a big tin bucket that was used exclusively for this purpose. That bucket then would have been brought outside to the back of the yard and dumped into the privy. Cleaning that bucket would be the last and most hated task at the end of the day before Bridget went to bed. So now we're going to climb up one more flight of stairs up to the children's bedroom floor. Today, these bedrooms are used for museum offices, but in the 19th century, when the Treadwells lived here, the children's bedrooms would have been on this floor. We don't know exactly who slept where. It would have been common for older children to be divided by sex and for very young children to be housed together in one nursery. Childcare was probably something that Bridget helped out with. In a family like this one with so many children, the servants often would have been asked to manage the children or to look after them. However, this would not have been a regular part of Bridget's job description. The proximity of servants to children and the amount of time that they spent together caused a lot of tension and worry in many families. Remember, Bridget, being Irish, is Catholic, and families like the Treadwells were Protestant. And so we talked a little bit about religious tension at the beginning of the tour, but there are countless articles written in ladies' magazines about how to protect your children from your Catholic servants. There was this fear that your servants might actually abscond with your children and take them to a Catholic church to have them baptized there, or that your Catholic servants might try to convert your children to Catholicism. Of course, given what we've seen so far of all of the work that Bridget would have been responsible for on a daily basis, you can imagine Bridget having absolutely no time to be absconding with anyone's children. If we climb up the next flight of stairs up to the servants' quarters, here you see that there's a large work area in the center of the room and then two small bedrooms to the north and south of the house. And so we'll step into this bedroom here. At the end of a long day of work, Bridget would come up here to rest. This is a difficult job with very long hours. And so it's likely that Bridget is not spending very much time in this room. The servants slept two to a room. Metal beds were provided for servants as a means of preventing bed bugs, because bed bugs can't burrow into metal like they can into wood. Of course, there are all sorts of class implications there, that you as a wealthy homeowner feel very comfortable sleeping on a wooden bed yourself, but you feel that Bridget and your other servants, being Irish immigrants, must somehow be more prone to vermin and in need of this preventive measure. To talk a little bit about clothing, as we see on this mannequin here in this servant bedroom. In the parlors, we talked about how Bridget would have aspired to this new wealthy lifestyle that she's witnessing, and that would have included clothing as well. If Bridget were lucky, she might receive hand-me-down clothing from the Treadwell family, perhaps at Christmas. And we know that many young servant women spent a lot of their wages on clothing. You've got your room and board covered here in this house, and so you don't have a lot of expenses as a servant. And you can imagine you're 19 years old, you're new in New York. You want to buy yourself some nice clothes. Particularly later in the 19th century, once mass-produced clothing was more widely available, servants spent a lot of money on clothing. Bridget in 1855 would not have worn a uniform. She would have just worn her regular clothes to do work in this house. And so as servants acquired fancier clothing, this often irritated the families that they worked for, who saw them as reaching above their station. Particularly once mass-produced clothing becomes more common, if everyone is shopping at Lord & Taylor or Macy's, the idea that your maid might buy the same dress that you have was upsetting for many wealthy women. And so this idea of a servant reaching above her station is part of why uniforms were required later in the 19th century. So without much time off and with room and board covered, women and girls like Bridget were saving a lot of their wages. Much of this money would be sent home to Ireland to care for their families in the midst of famine. The Emigrant Savings Bank, which you see an illustration pictured here, was established in New York City in 1850 by the Irish Emigrant Society, which was founded in 1841 for the protection of immigrants from Ireland. The bank offered a safe place to keep your money and a safe way to send money back home to relatives. By the 1870s, it was estimated that a third of all money circulating in Ireland actually came from America. Money that wasn't staying in Ireland was being used to bring family here to America. Remember, it costs $20 to bring someone over, and Bridget is making $3 or $4 a month, so it doesn't take long for her to accrue this money needed to bring her family over. Women like Bridget were responsible for bringing over thousands of their family members to America and starting a chain migration so strong that by 1901, over 3 million women had immigrated from Ireland during the 19th century, which is actually more than were left in Ireland at that time. Many of these women entered New York through Castle Garden, which you see pictured here. Castle Garden opened as an immigrant landing depot in August of 1855. So during the next 34 years, over 8 million people entered the United States through Castle Garden. 2 out of every 3 immigrants to the United States in this period passed through. Castle Garden ultimately closed in 1890. This mass immigration, sparked by the wages of young women like Bridget, made Irish culture a definitive part of the makeup of New York City. And as time went on, after fighting much prejudice, the Irish assimilated and gained political power, and the story of the Irish is now woven into the history of our city. Bridget's story is inextricably linked to the New York City we know today. Bridget may have been the first member of her family to come here, and it's her wages that brought over the other members of her family. Young women like Bridget are really responsible for the story of the Irish in New York today. But of course, it's important to remember that Bridget did not know that she was making history. Bridget was a lonely girl. She was far from home. She was trying to adjust to a strange new city and a different culture and a difficult job and build a better life for herself and her family. And so many of the issues that Bridget faced and that we've talked about on the tour today are still impacting domestic workers here in New York City and around the world. And so while we might not know much about Bridget Murphy and her fears and her hopes and her dreams, we can say one thing for certain. The lifestyle that was enjoyed by the Treadwell family and their peers would have been absolutely impossible without Bridget. So thank you so much for joining us for the tour this evening. We do have time for a couple questions. If anybody has any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen, and I would be happy to answer. Right. You're a quiet group tonight, no questions. That's fine. If anybody has any questions and you think of them later, of course, feel free to email us or reach out on social media. The Merchants House is currently open to visitors on Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. We have options for both guided and self-guided tours, so you can visit our website at merchantshouse.org for tickets and more information. We have lots of events coming up, both in person and virtual, and we hope to see you there. In honor of the Treadwell's Irish servants, you can join us this Friday on St. Patrick's Day for our Spirit of the Irish Candlelight Ghost Tour. As some of you may know, the Merchants House has been called Manhattan's most haunted house by the New York Times, and many of the most interesting stories took place in the servants' quarters. And so this unique tour on Friday evening actually will visit the fourth floor servants' quarters. We do have a few tickets still available, so you can check our website at merchantshouse.org/calendar for tickets and more information. Tonight's program and all of our virtual events was offered free of charge. To support the museum and our future programming, please consider joining us as a member or making a donation. It is the support of friends like you that keeps us pushing forward. Donate online at merchantshouse.org/support. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone.